Howdy, and welcome to Brandi's Book Stack. Today, we will be going Gothic literature, and we'll be talking about the 10 Gothic novels you must read, according to the website ready.com. And without further ado, let's jump into the stacks. So number one in their list is The Castle of Otranto. This is a book that I just recently finished reading for the first time. It's by Horace Walpole, and it's considered by many to be the first work of Gothic literature. I enjoyed this book. It is, by modern standards, pretty silly. If you're a weenie about reading modern horror, you don't like guts and gore and that kind of thing, this is a great read for you in the spooky season. We follow the tale of this, made-up country ruled by a king, and there is a family curse that lingers over them. And the book begins by the son being killed by a giant helmet from a suit of armor, like big as a man, coming and crushing the son. So that's kind of what I mean when I say it's a little bit silly and preposterous. But the king decides that with his son and heir gone, he must have another heir. And very like Henry VIII, decides he needs to divorce his wife and marry a young bride. And he selects the bride that was intended for his son before he died. And most of the book is her trying to avoid his advances and his attempts to marry her and divorce his wife. It is silly at times, and it has a lot of the tropes that we've come to expect in haunted houses and things of that nature. You know, the clanking chains in the dungeon, the picture that comes to life, that sort of thing. It's very kind of Scooby-Doo level of horror, if you know what I mean by that. It's very fun, and I enjoyed it a lot. It's also very short. This version is only 128 pages. And that includes introduction and an afterword. So it's not a difficult read. Very fun for the spooky season. Highly recommend it. The next book on their list is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And if you've never read Frankenstein, don't be fooled and think that it is like the movies that you may have seen. About the only movie that even attempted to be accurate was Robert De Niro's version from, I believe it was the 90s. But most of them, you know, where you see the monster and it's, and he's not intelligent, that is nothing like the book. In Mary Shelley's book, we follow Victor Frankenstein, who is the doctor, not the monster. And he creates life, but he doesn't tend to the life that he created. And it's a lot about what it means to be alive, what it means to be a creator, and what your responsibilities are to your creation. And there's a lot of commentary on loneliness and the need for companionship in this book as well. It's very deep, and it's hard to believe that Mary Shelley wrote this as a teenager. The story goes that Mary Shelley and Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, her husband, were all together in a chalet and decided to dare each on a stormy night and decided to dare each other to write their best ghost story. And Frankenstein is what Mary Shelley came up with, and I think she succeeded pretty well. So definitely check this out, especially if you've never, if all you've ever seen is the movies. Completely different story and well worth reading. The next on the list is a story I've had a close affiliation with since I was very young for some weird reason, and that's The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. You can see I have my, Tales of Mystery by Edgar Allan Poe here, which includes that story. We follow a man who is suffering potentially from madness, and is trying to protect his sister from falling into the same madness. And it becomes a question of protection versus control in this story. And I think a lot of Gothic literature does contain the theme of control. We see that over and over again in many of the books. And in this case, there's this fear of madness and the attempt to control both the individual from the curse of madness, if you will, and to try to control the actions of his sister. Even the visitor that comes, that's sort of our everyman point of view in this short story, he also is sort of, in a way, attempting to control the sister through his desire for her. It's very hard for her to have her own agency throughout the story. It's really, really interesting. And I think a fear of madness is something we can all relate to, because that's something that can happen to any of us. It's a really excellent read. I think any of Edgar Allan Poe's stories would be a great fit if you want to dive into some Gothic literature, because they all sort of fit that theme. And I should have mentioned from the get-go, what is Gothic literature? And I think with Wikipedia, I had probably the best definition. It's a loose literary aesthetic of fear and haunting. So that fits a lot of Poe's stories. Moving on to the next book on the list, we have Jane Eyre, which is one of my favorite stories of all time. And this follows a story of a young woman's life from the time she's very young. She's an orphan, and she's mistreated by her relatives and eventually sent off to a school for poverty-stricken children. And she has a pretty awful time there, but she manages to grow up and succeed and become a governess, and then eventually goes to be a governess for Mr. Rochester, who is the love interest in this story. And there's a mystery. There's some mysterious sounds in the attic. There's some mysterious things that happen, and you're not really sure until that is revealed. But it definitely has this great Gothic vibe. The aesthetic is, very gloomy out on the moors. And in this big country house where there's all these kind of weird sounds and happenings. If you're really wanting a Gothic read, Jane Eyre's a great one. And again, we see sort of this theme of control. Jane doesn't have control over her life for most of it until eventually tables are turned. But, she's under the control of her relatives who mistreat her. She's under control of a school that is corrupt. Then she's under the control of Mr. Rochester, who has his own secrets. And in the end, she finally maintains her own control, which is what makes this, I think, a better than average Gothic story. Next on the list, we have The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. I did not expect the depth that was in this story. And how, one of the most frightening things is our inability or ability to control ourselves. And this is really, really well drawn in this particular story. It's been a while since I've read it, and I was just thinking, I have this edition and I haven't read it in this edition yet, and it contains some other tales. And so I think I'll have to dive into this one pretty soon and do a reread. But it is an excellent story, and it's another one that's very short. Like this whole book is not Jekyll and Hyde. It is only, let's see, looking through here, it is only 107 pages of this book, so only this much. So it's a really slim read, easy to get into and enjoy, and this is the perfect time of year for it. Definitely suggest The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The next book on the list is one I don't own, and that is Dracula. I am not a fan of Dracula. I know many people love it. And I don't find Dracula very scary, honestly. I think that's one of the problems I have with it. Another problem I have with it is that it is written in an epistolary style, or in letters. And I really dislike that style of novel. I also feel like it's very misogynistic. And I know you expect that to some degree when you read an older work of literature, when women didn't have the rights that they do today. But I felt like Dracula in particular, as long as women are virgins, they are pure and good. And the minute they think about having a sexual relationship, they're no longer considered pure or good. Even his own wife, it almost applies to her before and after their marriage. And her friend is kind of looked as a hussy because she courted several men at the same time. And that's why Dracula decided to come for her. It just bleh, I didn't like it. And I just didn't feel like the story moved along very well. I felt like you kind of had to plod through it, and it just wasn't the book for me. Plenty of people love it and think it's one of the best books ever. My father-in-law loves that book, but it's just not for me. So take your chance if you want to try Dracula. I just wouldn't be the one to recommend it. The next on the list is one I would recommend, and that is Henry James, The Turn of the Screw. I love Henry James. I have it on my TBR to read a lot more of his works. I really love The Turn of the Screw and Daisy Miller as well. I think they're both phenomenal. The Turn of the Screw, we follow a governess in a country house taking care of two children. And this is one of the first times we see the creepy children trope in literature. There is some surmises that these children may have been molested at some point, which in this world, not in ours, in this world, is viewed like it's corrupted them irretrievably. And the governess believes that there's some ghostly happenings with them, that these children are somehow in league with the devil. And there's these ghost sightings of the former governess, and I think it was a governess and a tutor that got together and had a relationship out of wedlock. And it's an unreliable narrator type of story, so you don't know whether to believe the governess or to think maybe the governess has lost it a little bit and this is all in her head. And we're not told at the end of the story. So I normally don't like ambiguous endings, but in this case, it really, really works. It adds to the creepiness of the story. And it also talks a lot about sort of the repressive society that James was living in, and how particularly women's sexuality was repressed. And the governess does seem to have a lot of issues with that. So you really question whether she's seeing these things or their manifestation of her own guilt and repression. It's a great, great book. And again, it's another really short one. And I'll look to show it's half of this book. And you can see that's as long as it is. So it's an easy, quick read. I will say, fair warning, Henry James's writing style does take some effort to get into, but it's well worth it at the end. The next book on the list is Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. This is a brilliant novel, and I will say, when I read this for the first time, I had a very difficult time getting through it. I didn't like where I thought the book was heading, but if you feel like me and you're reading this, stick through to the end, because the payoff is worth it. The ending makes this book worthwhile. We follow a young woman in this book not Rebecca. And I don't think she's ever named throughout this book. But she's a young woman who's kind of had bad luck in life. She has been orphaned, and she's kind of having to work as a caretaker to this obnoxious older lady. And she meets this widowed man who is, or widower man, who has lost his first wife, Rebecca. And she falls in love with him, and they get married. But when she arrives at the home, at his home, she feels like the ghost of Rebecca, the first wife, is following her everywhere. She feels like she can't live up to this memory that everyone had of Rebecca. She feels like she can't live up to her husband's memory of Rebecca. And yet, maybe Rebecca wasn't all that she seemed to be. And so it's a mystery that unfolds throughout this book. And like I said, the ending is phenomenal. It is well worth hanging through the beginning of the book to get there. I loved it. I think it's 5 out of 5 stars. You should definitely check Rebecca out. The next book on the list is The Haunting of Hill House. I think this is another absolutely brilliant book. I think Shirley Jackson is one of the most underrated authors that's out there. I think she's starting to kind of get the recognition that she has long deserved. This book, and keep in mind, horror is not my most loved genre, but this particular book is so literary, and the themes of it are so intense. I really, really, really enjoyed this book. One of the things I like about it is it talks about isolation and loneliness being one of the worst fears that humans can have. And, you know, while the house is ostensibly what is causing all this psychological damage, the real psychological damage is in the individual person, the main character, who feels very disassociated and lonely from everyone else. And there's a lot of, again, unreliable narrator question here. You know, are the things happening, or are they happening in her mind? It's hard to tell. And again, I like that in kind of a spooky story. I think it works well. And again, the ending is very gripping. It's not happy, but it's a gripping, good ending. I highly recommend it. And all of the books that I've talked about today and we'll talk about today, none of them are what I would consider super scary. This is probably the scariest of all of them. And even it is not all that terribly scary. You know, there's not a lot of blood, guts, gore, really, really horrifying stuff. It's not too hard to read if you're a bit of a weenie like I am. The last book I don't have a copy of. I did read it and check it out from the library, and that's The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. And this is another one I didn't particularly care for. The Bloody Chamber takes a lot of fairy tales and sort of turns them on their edge with a more feminist and sexual twist. Carter, she really grips on to sort of the underlying sexuality that is in a lot of these fairy tales. How so much of it talks about, especially women, and the requirement for women to be pure, and while there is no requirement for men to do the same. And that underlies all these stories. I just kind of feel like maybe it's just been so overdone by this point. There's been so many fairy tale retellings that kind of do similar things. Now, to be fair to Angela Carter, she was one of the first. I'll also say I have a bit of a prejudice against Angela Carter because she was a big fan of Marquis de Sade. And if you know historically what the Marquis de Sade did, he was a horrible human being. He raped women, tortured women, and I have a hard time, with someone saying they're a feminist and then they're also a big fan of Marquis de Sade. Maybe a fan of his writings and not a fan of him personally. I don't know, but I find that disturbing also. But I just wasn't a huge fan. I didn't think they were all that gripping to read. It's not a very long novel, so if you want to give it a shot, if that sounds really entertaining to you, absolutely give the book a try. It just wasn't my cup of tea. So that's the 10 Gothic novels that Reedy said we should read, which I'm never a big fan, by the way, of website or YouTuber telling you should read this. You must read this. Maybe should, but not, definitely not must. You read what you like and what you think sounds interesting. But I do think some of these recommendations were very worthwhile and good, but I also think they left a few off the list. So here's a few I think they probably should have considered. One is The Woman in White and The Haunted Hotel by Wilkie Collins. I think, first of all, I'm a Wilkie Collins stan, so of course I'm going to recommend one of his books. But these are both Gothic classics. The Woman in White talks a lot about stolen identity and madness as well, and it's very entertaining. The Haunted Hotel is just kind of a good classic. It implies it's a vampire story, but we find out it's not. So it's definitely worth a try. I think it's very clever. I can't believe that they selected Jane Eyre for a Gothic novel and not Wuthering Heights. I like Jane Eyre better than Wuthering Heights, but Wuthering Heights is usually cited as a Gothic, standard novel. So I thought that was kind of surprising. I just read the novel Lolly Willows, which I think is definitely an outstanding Gothic novel. It's very different. It even has some devil worship in it. So if you're put off by that, you might want to skip it, but it is really excellent, and it's an excellent feminist novel as well. They did pick the Shirley Jackson Haunting of Hill House, which I think is the better novel. I'm surprised they didn't also include We Have Always Lived at the Castle, one of her other famous novels, which is also worth checking out. I was also surprised I didn't see The Mysteries of Udolpho on this list by Anne Radcliffe. That is usually considered one of the OG Gothic novels. I have not read it. It's one I hope to get to soon. And then Phantom of the Opera. I think, if you're going to include Dracula, Frankenstein, that kind of thing, I think Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux is another one that is a Gothic classic you should check out. For something more modern, Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. The first 3 books in that series are well worth a read and are an excellent vampire story. It is a little bit more in the gore and horror, traditional horror, if you're afraid of that. But I was able to hack it, and I'm a pretty big weenie, so you might check that out. And Beloved, I've actually seen listed as a Gothic novel, and I can get along with that. Sort of that, it is a ghost story if you weren't aware. And I really don't want to explain too much about it because I'm afraid it'll give away the plot, but it is more, the control issue there is between a slaveholder and a slave. So, and the ghost is of a child that was lost due to slavery, and I'll just leave it at that. Toni Morrison is brilliant. If you've never read Beloved, it will wreck you. So, have the tissue box close at hand, but it's an amazing novel and definitely worth a read. I don't want to think it's spooky, scary, but I have seen it listed on some of the Gothic novel lists and think it's worth a read. So those are some of the ones I feel like were left out. I don't know if you have any that you think, oh my gosh, I can't believe they didn't include this. If so, please leave a comment down below. Thank you for watching. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell. Thanks. Bye.